right, so in Chapter 9, we are going to be looking at life at the turn of the 20th century, so from about 1870 to 1915, and we are going to be talking about the expansion of education, some of the new forms of entertainment during this time. We're going to be talking about the Jim Crow laws, racial discrimination, and then also the changing roles of women. All right, so first section here is on the expansion of education. These are some of the questions that we're going to be answering throughout this first section of notes. So how and why did public schools expand during the late 1800s? How did opportunities for higher education increase after the Civil War? And what were the views of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois regarding African American education? So growth of public schools, more than 50% of white children were attending public school, but a high school diploma was still not the norm. Students went to school to learn to read, write, and cipher, or do basic arithmetic. In farm communities, older students only went to school from November to April so that they could help their parents in the fields the rest of the year. Public schools played a role in assimilating immigrants into American way of life, and remember, assimilation is just the process by which people of one culture become part of another. African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Asian Americans often went to separate and inferior schools from white Americans, so they were attending schools that were not as in high quality as the white schools. This bar graph here just shows the illiteracy in the United States from 1870 to 1920. As you can see, we have the percent in population here and the year down below. And as time seems to go on, these illiteracy rates seem to actually go down or decrease. And so, again, we're seeing people become more literate, meaning that they have the ability to read and write over time. Rules for teachers. Teachers each day will fill lamps, clean chimneys. Each teacher will bring a bucket of water and scuttle of coal for the day's session. Make your own pens carefully. You may whittle nibs to the individual taste of pupils. Men teachers may take one evening each week for courting purposes, or 2 evenings a week if they go to church regularly. After 10 hours in school, the teachers may spend the remaining time reading the Bible or other books. Women teachers who marry or engage in unseemly conduct will be dismissed. Every teacher should lay aside from each day's pay a goodly sum of his earnings for his benefit during his declining years, so that he will not become a burden on society. And the teacher who performs his labor faithfully and without fault for 5 years will be given an increase of 25% per week in his pay, providing the Board of Education approves. Again, these are just some of the rules for teachers during this time period, and oh my goodness, have times changed. Higher education expands. So women in higher education. Between 1880 and 1900, more than 150 new American colleges and universities opened. College enrollments doubled. Women called for more educational opportunities. Educators and philanthropists, or people who give donations to worthy causes, established private women's colleges. New York's Vassar College, which opened in 1865, was the first. African Americans in higher education. In 1890, only a few colleges, including Oberlin, Bates, and Bowdoin, accepted blacks. By 1900, more than 2,000 students had graduated from 34 African American colleges. Very few African American women attended college. There were only about 30 black women studying in American colleges in 1891. Two different perspectives on African American education. Booker T. Washington, he founded the Tuskegee Institute in Atlanta, taught students to put aside temporarily their desire for political equality, and thought that African Americans should focus on building economic security by gaining vocational skills, or skills that they could use to start a career following high school. Washington's ideas reassured those whites who worried that educated African Americans would seek more would seek more equally. W.E. Du Bois, he became the first African American to earn a Ph.D. from Harvard, believed that the brightest African Americans had to lead their people in their quest for political and social equality and civil rights, argued for future leaders to seek a liberal arts education rather than the vocational education promoted by Washington. In 1905, Du Bois helped found the Nicaragua movement that called for full civil liberties. So these two had very different views. Booker T. Washington believed that you should focus on getting an education that can help you to be successful in the world. And then as you become successful, you can prove to other people, specifically whites, that you are worthy of equality and that you deserve it. And then, obviously, Du Bois, W. Du Bois, he believed in a little bit different avenue, that we should, or African Americans should, get an education, but not necessarily a vocational education, and become leaders of your race and fight for equality. And fight now. Okay, expansion of education assessment. Schools for African, Mexican, and Asian Americans were A, separate and unequal, B, separate but equal, C, closer to their neighborhoods than white schools, D, places where you could learn exclusively about their history and culture. W.E. Du Bois believed that African Americans should learn a vocation or trade, B, put aside their desire for equality, seek political and social equality, or D, remain in segregated schools so that they could learn exclusively about their history and their culture. Here are the answers for those two questions. All right, new forms of entertainment. So this is section 2, and these are some of the questions that you're going to want to be able to answer at the end of this section. What new kinds of performances and recreation did Americans enjoy at the turn of the century? What were people reading for information and entertainment? And how was American music changing? Performances and recreation. The most popular kind of live theater was vaudeville, a type of inexpensive variety show that first appeared in the 1870s. Movies began to give vaudeville competition. By 1908, the nation had 8,000 Nickelodeon theaters set up in converted stores or warehouses that charged a nickel admission. In 1872, the introduction of the circus train made the annual visit of the circus an anticipated event all over America. Amusement parks featured music, games of skill, vaudeville productions, bathing beaches, and exciting rides. Women and men watched and participated in sports. The most popular was baseball. Some of the others were football, basketball, bicycle riding, ice skating, swimming, gymnastics, and tennis. So what were people reading? Most people were reading newspapers, magazines, and popular fiction. So with newspapers in the late 1800s, newspapers became a very popular form of entertainment as well as a source of information. To sell papers, publishers urged reporters to discover lucrative details of murder, vice, and scandal. This sensational news coverage came to be called yellow journalism, and we'll talk more about this a little later on. Popular magazines of the era featured stories appealing to the average American's desire to succeed, influencing the rags to riches stories. Magazines also contained helpful articles and advertising. Popular fiction, rags to riches stories and adventure yarns also appeared as dime novels, inexpensive books with a wide readership. More educated readers turned to serious novels by Henry James and Edith Wharton, and the social protest novels of Upton Sinclair, like The Jungle. Local color writers satisfied their audience's hunger for information about distant places of the country. Music diversions, so we saw the Negro Spiritual, Ragtime and Jazz, and Music at Home. The Negro Spiritual, one series of concerts in 1871, introduced African-American religious folk songs called spirituals to white audiences. The concerts were originally organized as a fundraiser by a music teacher at the African-American Fisk University. Ragtime and jazz originated among black musicians in the South and Midwest in the 1880s. The music featured melodies with shifting accents over a marching band beat. Jazz grew out of vibrant music culture of New Orleans. By 1915, jazz and jazz dances were becoming a national passion. Two new inventions allowed people to enjoy music at home. The player piano was a piano that had a paper roll played by wooden fingers to reproduce the music recorded on the roll. And the phonograph, invented by Thomas Edison in 1877, sold it at a rate of more than $500,000 per year by 1914. All right, so new forms of entertainment questions. What was yellow journalism? Was it A, a new type of ink for newspaper printing, B, news stories by frightened reporters, C, news stories about the personal lives of vaudeville stars, or D, reporting that uncovered the lurid details of murders and scandals? And then who were given credit for inventing the photograph? Was it A, Alexander Graham Bell, B, George Washington Carver, C, Thomas Edison, or D, Sarah Jewett? These are the answers for those questions. All right, section 3, the world of Jim Crow. How were African Americans discriminated against after Reconstruction, and how did African Americans resist this discrimination? So this chart here just shows voter restrictions for African Americans in the South in 1889 through 1909. And then here are some of the various states where voter restrictions were in place. And so we saw typically 4 different types: the grandfather clause, the property test, the literacy test, and the poll tax. So property test, you had to have property in some areas and a certain amount. Literacy test, you had to pass a literacy test, reading and writing, in order to vote. And these tests were so difficult at times that even white males could not pass them either. And they made them difficult on purpose because they were trying to keep African Americans from voting. They also would charge African Americans at times to vote, and a lot of times they could not afford to pay this fee. And then the grandfather clause was that if you did not have a grandfather or anyone else from your previously in your family that had voted in the past, then you could not vote. And for slaves, most of them did not have any members that had ever voted, and so this kept them from voting. So if all of these failed, if they had property, if they were educated, and if they had money, they still couldn't vote because they didn't have any ancestors that had. And so again, this was just a way in which states did whatever they could to keep African Americans from voting. All right, post-Reconstruction discrimination. During this period, many states also instituted a system of legal segregation. Segregation means separation of people by race. When this separation is a result of custom, it is called de facto segregation. In the South, segregation was required by statutes called Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow laws are just going to be the laws of discrimination against African Americans. One of the greatest setbacks to African American equality was the Supreme Court establishment of the separate but equal doctrine in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson. So in this court case, basically they ruled that separate is okay. It's okay that African Americans and whites are separate as long as the facilities are equal. But what ended up happening is that they were never equal. Violence or the threat of violence was a way that whites kept African Americans in their place. The worst form of violence was lynching or murdering of an accused person by a mob without a lawful trial. Many African Americans moved to the North to escape violence and legal segregation. However, they found de facto segregation in housing, education, and employment. As the conditions deteriorated for African Americans, black leaders began to seek new solutions. Bishop Henry Turner advocated black pride and immigration to Africa. Booker T. Washington supported legal cases against segregation and gave financial support to civil rights in black businesses. W.E. Du Bois founded the Nicaragua movement. Participants in this movement insisted on equality and vowed never to accept inferiority nor bow to oppression. Wells refused to leave a segregated railroad car and filed a lawsuit against the railroad company. She initially won the lawsuit, but it was overturned by Tennessee Supreme Court. She began an editorial campaign in speaking to her against lynching. The NAACP, National Association for Advancement of Colored People, formed in 1909 and works to abolish segregation and discrimination to oppose racism and to gain civil rights for African Americans. All right, so 2 questions here. What was the purpose of the grandfather clause? And then Plessy v. Ferguson was a Supreme Court decision that established doctrine of... And then here are the answers to those questions.